Keeping watch over America's military and spy satellites is the top priority at this classified Space Force Ops Center in Colorado. More than 70% of military satellite communications come through here. Everything from nuclear command and control orders to presidential communications, down to a Coast Guard cutter, a submarine, even tactical units on the ground. Lieutenant Christine Kovac's job is to keep an eagle eye on those satellites.
If they don't have the communications when they need it, things can go seriously wrong. So we're here providing that perfect, reliable communication.
How vulnerable are American satellites? The Pentagon says China's space program is now outpacing the U.S. with more than 60 launches in 2022, building a remote robotic post on the far side of the moon invisible to U.S. satellites. And U.S. generals worry Beijing could soon deploy satellites and offensive weapons in the space between the moon and Earth, an area called cislunar, invisible to U.S. satellites.
We need to understand both in the lunar space and the space between the Earth and the moon. What are they doing? Why are they doing it? Does it pose a potential threat to our interests?
A military spacecraft in a very well designed trajectory can enable space situational awareness.
Physicist Camille Lance says a spacecraft in cislunar space could have strategic superiority.
Can enable a person or entity to be in a location which you have an advantage.
It's a big reason why Space Force has bipartisan support in Congress and a growing budget.
We have to remember, we are not weaponizing space. Space has already been weaponized by China and Russia. We have to be able to defend our assets, and we've got to be more aggressive in doing so.
In the coming years, the U.S. is preparing to launch a satellite to cislunar to monitor Chinese activity. And it's inevitable.
We don't want there to be a war in space. We want all of humanity to continue to use all the benefits of space for all of our good. But if others choose to start a war there, we'll be ready.
Preparing for a conflict no one wants. While the U.S. has been rushing military supplies to support Ukrainian forces battling the Russian military, another potential battlefield may be taking shape in space. And no, we're not talking about futuristic sci-fi movies. While the very idea of militarizing space is very disturbing to anyone who is intrigued with exploring what lies beyond Earth, Space Force was created because military commanders say America's adversaries are already demonstrating hostile intent in orbit. And in today's digital world connected by satellites, the entire global economy and the U.S. military are very dependent on instant satellite connectivity, something we're seeing firsthand on the battlefield in Ukraine. After decades of Cold War proxy battles between the U.S. and Russia, the battlefield in Ukraine quickly turned into a proving ground for the latest military hardware. From high-flying drones that shadow and target Russian tanks, to shoulder-fired weapons and advanced missile launchers, many guided by the constellation of 30 U.S. Space Force-operated orbiting GPS satellites. But at the Pentagon, four-star Space Force General David Thompson says Russia has been jamming the GPS signal on the ground in Ukraine, the same signal that the U.S. provides to the world for free.
It's that localized ability to jam the signal so that local receivers can't receive the information.
Ukrainians unable to access GPS because it's being jammed locally on the ground.
That's right. Ukrainians may not be able to use GPS because there are jammers around that prevent them from receiving and using the signal effectively.
U.S. military sources also claim Russia has launched cyber attacks against the SpaceX Starlink satellites over Ukraine that provide the country with internet access. Though SpaceX engineers were able to defend against the attack by rewriting several lines of computer code. And European airlines, first reported by Finnair, accused Russia of jamming the GPS signals along its borders with Finland that civilian airlines rely on. Russia, China, and Europe all have their own GPS satellite networks. But most of the world, including Ukraine and the global economy, depend on the U.S. GPS network, accurate to within a foot and a half. From suburban drivers to international shipping, to farming, to banking, to disaster response, to those Ukrainian military units. The U.S. Space Force is charged with protecting America's GPS network. We were given rare access to this secure command center where they monitor all U.S. GPS satellites for any signs of failure or foreign interference.
We're providing position navigation.
Major Lauren Taylor directs the operations here.
Each satellite actually broadcasts multiple signals, so the civilians get their signal, the military gets their signal.
Interestingly, the Russians and the Chinese can use our GPS satellites as well.
I bet you they do.
You taking that A5 over there?
Under U.S. law, the GPS system cannot be turned off to anyone. But military commanders say what's happening in orbit now is even more concerning, accusing both Russia and China of putting weapons in space.
It is truly a warfighting domain. Our adversaries are fielding specific weapon systems in the domain, so we need to view it as such.
And in a dramatic anti-satellite test in November 2021, Russia targeted and blew up one of its own satellites using a ground-based missile, creating a massive orbiting debris field with more than 1,600 pieces. The space station forced to adjust its position to avoid getting hit.
Indeed, the space station was threatened, which, by the way, not only have astronauts, it has cosmonauts on it.
China conducted a similar test in 2007, creating 3,000 pieces of orbiting debris.
I think they're trying to send a message that they could target somebody else as well, and now we have to deal with the aftermath of those tests.
The Pentagon says Russia has also deployed a nesting satellite that carries an offensive weapon, which it has already used to test fire a missile or bullet, very close to a top-secret American spy satellite.
They launched a satellite, they launched it into an orbit very close to one of our sensitive national security satellites. They maneuvered around that satellite in what we would call a hazardous and an unsafe and unprofessional manner. Then they backed that satellite off. What they did is that they then released a target. So the satellite had a target. They released that target. I would just call it a bullet, basically. It was a projectile. They just fired, I'll call it a bullet, from one satellite to the other. And the Russians knew very well that we could observe this. They were also making a very clear statement to us about their intention to threaten our capabilities.
And China has deployed a satellite with a robotic arm and claw that can reach out and grab or damage